everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Hey, welcome to the, as Andy's going to call it, the 20-Foot Pole podcast today. The season 3, episode 17. And as I promised you guys, we have a very special episode today. I've been trying to get these guests on here for a little while to talk about something that is going to be very challenging, but very important for us to talk about. And so our guests today are Melinda and Andy Massey, who are both masters of education, historians, and Melinda's our archivist here at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. So St. Matthew's is a historical church in this area, Charleston being a very, very historical settled city here, and a big deal settled southern city, just by the things that they did. And what was interesting about Charleston is it was settled a little differently. So it was settled by entrepreneurs and literally businessmen. And so that kind of describes a lot what was happening. And so to base then also that the things that they were doing was business and product based. And that also meant that, you know, as we know, a lot of the products and stuff that were done in this area was done with slave labor. And Charleston being one of the biggest slave ports in North America, right? Isn't it?
It was a major entry point for slaves, but it's not necessarily the largest slave market. You had them in Virginia, you had them in New Orleans. So you had some other places. So I can't say we were the largest. We were just one of those major entry points. But considering that a lot of your New England shippers were responsible for bringing the slaves over, you know, you had slaves up north, and you had slaves, as I said, in Virginia, South Carolina. Another big market was New Orleans later on. Yeah.
Okay. I knew it was something like that it was one of the bigger ones. So anyways, something in particular about the history of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. So the other call that I have besides the podcast here, and something that I learned about recently, and as a person who's not from the South, I found this a little bit more shocking than I think some people around here did for sure, is that St. Matthew's owned a slave. And the idea to me of a church owning a slave is still just, it's jarring. But again, I'm from a different time and place, and I understand that. And so can you tell me a little bit when both of you found out, because you guys found out at different times?
Well, I started working for the archive as a volunteer, and I want to say it was 2018.
Okay.
And I found out then, looking at all the historical documents that we have up there in the archive, I found out then that we had a bill of sale for a slave.
And you said that like it was a known thing, like the people that work in the archives, they knew that.
Yes.
But it wasn't like public knowledge in the congregation anymore.
Well, I don't know that other than the ladies who had established this archive and collected the documents and everything and had gone through them, I don't know how many people outside in the congregation knew. We've had some researchers come in, and one was Andrea Merlanda from Germany, and so she did a lot of research upstairs and did research on the slave or the German community in Charleston, Richmond, and New Orleans, and looked at and included the slave information related to the Germans at that time. This book came out in 2011, and she was also made some guest appearances, and there were some newspaper articles, whether that, and I'd have to go back and look at that article, whether it mentioned that Alec, at that time, Alec was in the book. So that's what I can tell you as far as when I found out about it, and I didn't blink. Being the history person, I just kind of said, okay, that makes a lot of sense, considering that this was the time period.
And then Andy, you?
Well, my introduction was as a member of church council because our senior pastor, Pastor Eric, was made aware of the situation, and he felt, based on all of the things that were going on at the time, which that was in 2019, I believe, that with the direction the ELCA was going, with things that had happened in Charleston, with some apologies that had been rendered, that he felt like that we needed to have a statement and to think about this idea of the apology.
Yeah.
So that was how I got introduced into it, and as it goes on church councils, I spoke to the issue, which immediately gets you put onto the next function of the task.
Yeah. Well, if you care about it, clearly you have to be on the committee of this now, don't you? Yeah.
That's the way it works.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you do have a little background in history, so.
Right, and I was very interested in the response in our council when it was first talked about. Mm-hmm. Because there were wide ranges of responses, which I felt like it ultimately ended up mirroring how our congregation felt.
Yeah.
And there are things that, I would, some of these are dear to my heart because I've heard my own relatives say some of them.
Well, how did the congregation feel?
Well, some things like absolutely, us making an apology and saying this is the right thing to do and we need to go further. We had some said it's the right thing to do, but I am not a racist. Mm-hmm. We had a camp that said, what's the big deal? It was the South in the 1850s. Mm-hmm. Another camp, absolutely the wrong thing to do. You let sleeping dogs lie.
Or I think you said at some point in time, I heard you say to me, like people said, why are we taking the skeletons out of the closet?
Another thing was the concern that the church, because this was the time of George Floyd situation, and we had some activity here on King Street, and so everybody said, if this becomes knowledge, the church is going to be receive the brunt of this.
It's going to be a target.
And I'll echo that because it was real interesting that one of the comments specifically made was, I do not want to see the church burned down again.
Yeah. So a couple things also about St. Matthew's for those that are, listening from very far away and who have never been here. St. Matthew's is on King Street in Charleston on the corner of King and Calhoun, which is a major intersection and is the major area down here. So it is like the prime spot, like King Street's where all the parades are. Everything goes right by. Like this is a major area. And another thing to note is that the church did burn down once. Well, not all the way. Not all the way to the ground, no, but like...
We lost the top part.
It was pretty bad.
That was 1965.
Yeah. In 1965, as Melinda said.
And then another segment, and I think this is the most important, as we started to talk to our congregation, was I described a camp that was silent. People that listen to what you're saying and people who don't even engage. And I think that becomes the more difficult part because if that, how much of the majority is represented by that camp.
Yeah.
And as you start to do the hard work of what is our response to this knowledge.
Yeah. So after we had sort of like made it known, you guys started doing research in 2020 to see how much that we can learn about this individual whose name is Alexander, or Alec, as is represented in the minutes. So it's interesting to know. So please, can you start with talking about the German community that was here, and why it would have been, normal or not normal for them to acquire, to buy a slave?
Yeah, I think that there's, the whole idea is of these group of immigrants coming in various timetables, and how are they being assimilated into the structure of what it is. And we're, so in the city of Charleston, the Germans are coming in, and I may use the wrong term. A lot of them are in mercantile industries, shops, bakeries, things like that. But we also have, so it's that second generation that's starting to come in, who have been born in the South. And I think then that's why we may see that. I think we also have to layer on that some of the difficulties and challenges with a lot of epidemic deaths, yellow fever, and that could have created more of an environment or a need for more help, particularly in digging graves, also the things going on in the church. So I think the assimilation factor is probably the biggest thing, and you're looking at that first generation that was born here in the South.
Of wanting to make it clear that they are Americans, right? And this is what it meant to be an American in this area, especially a white one, or to be considered an affluent person.
And the gentleman behind all of this was Johann Andreas Wagner. And Wagner was a believer in assimilation. He may not have owned slaves. He may not oppose slavery. He saw that assimilation process of being a part of the community, the white community, the community of Charleston, and being engaged in the politics and the business world and everything. And he did see it was detrimental if the German community, St. Matthew's, etc., came out opposed to the slavery. And as Andy was just saying, by the time we get to the second generations of Germans here in Charleston, that is part of the society slavery is. And so we see the businesses, we see the Germans living in the same communities and working in the same communities where we had free blacks and enslaved blacks living. And so you have that connection all the time. And you had it with the Irish as well here in the area. But you see it with the Germans.
Now, I know, like, up in New York area and stuff like that, the Irish were heavily looked down upon. Was that the same here or not? That's kind of a side note, but...
Probably it was the same period. The 1840s, 1850s is when you have that American Party, or what was referred to as the Know Nothing Party, where no Irish need apply.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was the late 1840s, 1850s period. Okay. And so you had that down here. And you probably, there might have been some prejudice, again, toward the Germans, but primarily, definitely Irish and others.
Okay. So something then, so St. Matthew's came across Alexander. And I say it that way because it's St. Matthew's, according to the archives that we have, they didn't decide, hey, we think we need to buy a slave, and then they decided how much money they wanted to pay, and then they went down to the markets and they started bidding and auctioning and stuff like that. That's not what happened. Instead, Melinda, would you tell us what happened and how we came to purchase Alexander?
Interesting story here. There was a gentleman named Thomas Gates who was a very prominent Charlestonian, I must say. He owned probably $100,000 plus in property. He was a butcher by profession. He owned properties like the Charleston Hotel. He was a board of directors of the Santee Canal and other organizations here in Charleston. And the other gentleman is Thomas Dixon. And Dixon was not as, we'll say, as prominent, not as wealthy as Mr. Gates. But Dixon also can be seen in several organizations, somewhat associating with Mr. Gates, and even some members of St. Matthew's in these organizations. And he was a butcher at one time. He may have been in some other businesses as well. I think he also wanted to work with a tavern, have a tavern. The thing then is that Mr. Dixon got secured a loan from Mr. Gates. And the security for that loan, I think of about $800, were 3 slaves. Alec, or Alexander as we call him too. He's had 3 different names basically. Another slave named Martha, and I think George was the other one. So those were the 3 slaves. And when and basically Dixon never paid Gates back any money. And when Gates died in 1852, the executors eventually, they send out the various messages. Anybody who has a claim against Mr. Gates's estate to please submit it. Well, in 1853, they let it be known, the three executors, and one of those was a member of St. Matthew's. But they let it be known that they were going to sell one of those 3 slaves to fulfill the debt. And so in the minutes at St. Matthew's, they decided to form a committee, several individuals, and they said that the highest that we would give for Alec, and they mentioned Alec by name or Alec by name in the minutes.
So they knew already that was who they were pursuing.
That's new. They knew. That's what's so interesting about this.
That
and
there's a conversation that happened in a room somewhere that they had agreed that what would be best for him, because he also, I don't know if it'd be best, but he also was, I don't know how to say it properly, but he was injured.
He had a hernia.
Yeah.
At least that's what we believe was the situation based on some information that we have. So I can't make assumptions for the conversations, but we know that there was a connection between the various men who knew Thomas Gates, the members of St. Matthew's, because they specifically mentioned Alec in the minutes. And they said the highest that they would bid would be $600. And that's what they bid, and they were the highest bidder on him.
All right.
And I would add that, I think what can get touched on is, there is the advertisement for this sale. And so the realization as you're doing this, you understand that slaves are bought and sold. You understand that they're human. But then when you also kind of grasp the economic need and involvement, I mean, the advertisement said he was not warranted sound.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's the actual terminology used.
Yeah.
And then that just all of a sudden takes a human being and makes him a commodity.
Yeah.
And that's tough. That's hard.
Mm-hmm. So how long was Alec owned by the church?
The church bought him in 1853, and the last set of any notation we have in our minutes is 1864. And we do not know if according to the way the minutes are written, if we gave him his freedom outright, or if because the minutes say that we are no longer holding him to paying us for any work that he did away from the church. And we also...
hang on. You're going to have to unpack that for a second.
Okay.
So what were Alex, what was his situation at the church as far as, did he make money? Did he not make money? He had to pay for what?
Well, he did make money.
Did we pay him?
We did. Mm-hmm. It shows up in the financial records there in the minutes as income and expenditures, because we paid him money for the bellows on the organ. Mm-hmm. He was paid money for digging graves. He was, in one set of the minutes, it says that he was supposed to take care of the upkeep of both cemeteries when we bought Bethany, our second cemetery. So he was engaged in a lot of that. Mm-hmm. But again, as far as the church at that time, it was the bellows. We do not know.
So we paid him for work that he did.
Mm-hmm.
Also provided him, I believe, with clothes and stuff, because I saw it on there that we had bought him a suit at least at one point in time. Yeah.
The council made sure that Mr. Henry Stender, who later would become president of the council during the time that we still owned Alec, would buy him a suit and shoes. And they even specified sometime no more a certain amount of money for that. The other thing, let me go back. The other thing is that Alec was allowed to go off church property and work for himself.
Yeah.
But he had to pay the church $10 of whatever he was making. He had to pay that back to the church. So he was making money from us, making money on his own, but he also brought in a little income, if you want to say it, for the church.
Okay. I actually interrupted you for you to tell us that information. You were talking about, because I was asking how long he was here. And so what you were saying was the end of the last record we have is just that he was no longer making money for us, or we were no longer paying him. He was no longer on the books.
I think the actual minutes is he is no longer required to pay us his wages.
Okay.
all right? And he was still engaged in working under the auspices of our sexton,
Yes.
all right? So we don't know specifically if he was freed.
Okay.
And that's unclear. And based on what we have learned, I think it would have been very difficult for us to have done that based on the laws that were on the books at that time.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think I'm gonna let Melinda do that because she'll be able to talk to you about it.
It's called manumission, and that is when you give a slave their freedom. In the state of South Carolina, you actually had to apply to the state legislature or the General Assembly for permission to free a slave. So I don't know that we would have done that. Maybe I would using our phrasing today, under the radar, but I don't think that we would have done that. So we just may have released our obligation to him and let Mr. Almers, who was the sexton, who also paid us a certain amount of money for the use of Alec, or Alexander as we were calling him after we brought him into our church. So that's the only thing we have left on him is that knowledge. We do not know whether he stayed in the house of Mr. Sender or stayed in the house of one of the members of the church. We don't know because of the original church building. There was a building and owned the property. We do not know if he stayed there. We don't know anything about his daily activities or nightly activities.
There was also there was a portion of Charleston where both free and enslaved blacks had their own kind of community on the edge of town, I believe. And there was possible that, maybe I learned this from you and you were talking with the campus ministry students, that it was possible that he could have lived in that community because a lot of, urban enslaved folks that worked in shops and stuff like that still lived in this community. They didn't live in the shop.
And that was Ward 3. This was Ward 4 over here, but that was Ward 3, and it was over there near the harbor. And so you had some tenant houses. You had some people who owned their houses over there, and you had, as I said, I think I said earlier, you had free blacks as well as enslaved, and they were living in these areas. And but at the same time, you had whites living in that area. So there's a possibility that he may have been housed in one of those residences. We just do not know.
Yeah. So, all right, what's interesting is, what we have to talk about Alec's life is what's in church council minutes. And so, if you've ever taken church council minutes and you're like, oh man, I don't know why we're doing this. This is a pain or whatever. Hey, you never know. In 200 years, people could be like, what were they doing? So anyway, so at some point in time, in 1864, which would have been around the time, because I believe Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1865. No?
January the 1st, 1863. I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought I got past 1863, but it didn't take effect until 65.
Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January the 1st, 1863. Now, the 13th Amendment was not until 1865.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking.
Maybe
of.
that's what you're thinking about. But
Get my dates backwards. Sorry.
But emancipation was earlier. In fact, Lincoln, after the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, already had this document that we call the Emancipation Proclamation written. And as some people say, he just more or less told it to his cabinet, you got to sign it, it's time. And so that's when they did it, but with the stipulation that it would go into effect January 1st. That's why we have the celebration. We had a parade January the 1st here in Charleston.
Well, yeah, and a lot of black churches celebrate Watch Night, so on the 31st instead of a New Year's Eve party.
Right.
I just thought it was 1865.
No, that's
so
exactly
that's
right.
just my error in date.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that had already happened, but didn't.
It didn't affect us.
Now, why is that?
Well, the proclamation said that in the areas of rebellion, the slaves are free. But as I always tried to tell people and tell my students when I was teaching, that black man or that slave is not free as long as he's still here in Charleston. The Union soldiers aren't here yet. The Union soldiers are down in Port Royal, and they're freeing the slaves there. The slaves know that they're free in the Beaufort area, Port Royal, Hilton Head area. And they might be free somewhere else because the Union soldiers are there. They're free at that point. They might be free on words, on paper, but until those soldiers showed up.
Well, and then that's the extra with the celebration of Juneteenth, right? Because that's when the Union got to Galveston, Texas. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Speaking of Galveston.
Yeah. That's where my parents live now. So I think so. That's what's I think important to maybe talk about is like those kind of specificities of dates, because even I just messed up the dates. Because I'm from Iowa, right? Like, by and large, we weren't really involved in a lot of this. We were still trying to figure out, which side of the river to build houses on. And so when, with my education and stuff and how they teach in schools, right? Like, well, the Emancipation Proclamation was this day, and then we won the Civil War on this day, and slaves were free. And so to kind of really actually say, well, no, that's not how this works, and that's not what happened, and that wasn't the story, is really important to tell. And so then what does it look like for our role in that, and when he was actually free, and how that would have happened? Because I don't know when the Union soldiers got to Charleston.
Charleston.
I feel like I should. I've taken some historical tours, but I don't.
Andy, you'll have to help me there, but I think I know Columbia fell in February of 1865. That's the capital of the state. And I think Charleston, a division of Sherman's troops, I think had come up into Charleston. So it might have been right around Christmas or maybe January. And then you had another section of these Sherman troops that went on up to Columbia. So it's right in that time period. So who knows? We don't know. Maybe Alec and others said, okay, this is our time. Let's leave. Let's join up with the soldiers, and we'll march off with them, or we'll go back to someplace and claim our rights.
Yeah.
Our land.
So
you guys tried to do some research. What happened to Alec when he left?
We have no record. We see a couple of mentions that possibly could be Alexander or Alec, but we have no definitive knowledge of what occurred to him after the last mention of him in our council minutes. And to touch on just what we were talking about, from my aspect, I think that if you look at when Atlanta fell and Sherman's march to the sea, I think that the writing was on the wall, and I think that was probably some of the impetus from our council, in my mind.
Just said, maybe it's time to part ways.
Right, and but
now, do you think that they intentionally would have let Alec go? I don't want to say freed, right? Because they would have had to go through all the hullabaloo to do that. But do you think that they would have intentionally just kind of let him go as a sort of to not be, a target when folks came into the city? I've never asked that question of you before. That one just popped into my head.
Yeah, I don't know. From that standpoint, I don't know if there's any evidence that we can even, speculate on that.
I don't like it.
Yeah, and I think that.
I know you don't. It's okay.
Yeah, and I really don't. And it's just, again, the way that the minutes is, it was, he was not responsible to pay and free to work on his own. And I don't know, Melinda, if you're actually getting the quote.
Yeah, that just sounds to me a lot like, he's sort of technically owned on paper, but we're just kind of parting ways.
Right. You're, it'd be like, probably a bad analogy, but.
I was thinking like a marriage separation.
Well, I'm even thinking more like I work at Starbucks, and they said, okay, instead of giving the money in the cash register back to the owner, you sold all this, you can just have it. Which is and again, it's completely anathema to what the economic realities were.
Yeah.
Here. October the 6th, 1864, the regular meeting of Church Council, and this is an excerpt from it, moved, seconded, and resolved that Alexander the slave shall from now on be free to work for himself without having to pay us his wages. Mr. Stender shall make the necessary arrangements with Mr. Almers. And Mr. Almers was the church sexton at that time. And so the meeting was then adjourned. And that's the last we have in our minutes.
Were these minutes still kept in German?
They were.
Okay.
And then they were translated after the archive was formed in 1980, 1990. And we had several people who translated them. Mary Ivester, who helped to start the archive, spoke German. She was originally from Walhalla, South Carolina, which was a place started by Wagner, a member of the St. Matthews, or actually a whole population of St. Matthews moved up there. So she had that German background, and she helped to translate some. We had a professor from, I think it was Clemson, who did some of the translating. Evelyn Alberts, who is still a current member of St. Matthews, translated, and we had some other people who translated. So there were several who did the translations. And, there again, there might be some questions in the translations, but I feel like this is pretty accurate.
Okay. Why, that's good. I was just curious. Yeah. Do you know when they stopped taking meeting minutes in German?
The minutes, let's see. It was really the process of changing over into English full time was somewhere during World War I, but officially 1922.
Yeah,
And
my congregation in Baltimore was like that right around World War I.
Yeah.
Magically, all the notes are now in English.
Yeah. Well, even before then, St. Matthews had in the late 1800s, had two services. We had the German service and we had the English service.
Okay.
We had the German Sunday school, we had the English Sunday school. Same thing for confirmation and for those individuals. And then in, I think it was the minutes, the annual meeting minutes of 1922, the church president, the council president, did his speech or his letter to the congregation in English, and he said something to the effect in our native language, referring to English as our native language. And so it led to some controversy because not everybody wanted to give up the German and so forth. But that's sort of when we began to transition.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else about Alexander that you really think that folks should know about that I didn't ask you?
Well, the minutes cited that he was a hard worker and he was dependable, and that he was in arrears because of the hernia and not being able to work, but he did contribute his money, I think, later on to make up some of that difference. So that is a comment on him, that he was a hard worker, he was faithful, or at least I'm not sure if they use the word faithful, but that's the impression you get from the minutes.
Yeah, he was very dependable.
He did his work.
Yeah, he always showed up, he did the things he was supposed to do.
That's the impression.
Yeah.
And as you deal with that and you understand those things, it kind of touches on some of the comments that you can hear. I talked about some of the comments, and a lot of times when people find out that their family owned slaves or an entity owned slaves, one of the questions is, well, but I'm sure we treated them well.
Yeah.
And I was really struck because in our conversations we had Dr. Powers, who is from the College of Charleston, is probably the most eminent historian in Charleston in regards to the slave. Melinda, would that be a correct statement? One of the top?
Yeah, he is. He's written several books on African Americans in Charleston, slavery, etc.
Yeah.
But he reminded us, but he was still a slave.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, that's the part of it for me, of and then how are you internalizing and dealing with the things you're hearing?
Yeah.
And learning.
Yeah, he was still property.
Yes.
Yeah. And in that, that does show in what we do know about him, right? Did he have a family?
We have no information. I mean, he came from Thomas Dixon. We don't know where Thomas Dixon obtained him.
We don't know if he was born here or if at that point in time he probably was, right?
Well, the African slave trade had supposedly come to an end in 1808 here in the United States. But I think it's 1808, or is it 1803? But anyway, regardless of that.
Several years before. Yeah.
Right, definitely before.
Yeah.
But what happened is that some of the older slave states, where the cotton states, where the land was beginning to become useless, not producing a lot, like Virginia, for example. What some of these states, and South Carolina was part of that, what we started doing was producing slaves to sell. So we don't know for sure where he came from.
Yeah.
He could have come from
when I meant here, I just meant like,
Oh.
North America. But you do draw a good point that he very well could have also been from Virginia or
Yeah.
another state as well, and been taken very far away from his family.
And like you said earlier, he could have been brought. The advertisements, we have two advertisements. One said 30, he was age 30 in 1853. Another one said he was approximately or about maybe 40. So there again, take that back. Here we are in 1853.
So somewhere
he
30, 40 years ago, okay. But we don't know if he had a family. We don't know where he went when he left here.
We do not. And that's, and we've done a decent amount of research trying to find out as much as we can. One of the things that was the result of all this, we had an intern from the College of Charleston, and Chris Cohn, and working with our group, it's a 79-page manuscript that was created, which really gives a good look at what it meant to be a German, a good little bit about what it meant to be an urban slave, but very little specifically about Alexander. And the one thing we do know, based on those advertisements for the sale, was knowledge of boating.
Okay.
And that was another thing, because one of our references that we thought might involve Alexander was a fight on the docks among the longshoremen. I think. And there's a mention of a name, but we have no way of concluding.
Yeah.
The gentleman's name was in the paper was Elick, Elick, Farr, Farr.
That got in the fight.
That got in the fight with another stevedore.
Okay.
Because he wasn't a member of the union.
Okay.
Longshoreman union.
Yeah. Got it. And you thought maybe that could be the same person and kind of pursue that trail a little bit, but overall we don't know. Why? So I know, Andy, specifically for you, you kind of got onto this. You kind of joked that you were roped onto this project as being a council member who was interested. But this is something that you're very passionate about. And why is it important that we talk about it and that we share the story of Alec, and why you also agreed to come on this podcast and talk about these things and share this with the wider church, right? Like, you're not now just sharing it with St. Matthew's and with the campus ministry. We're now sharing this with folks all across the country, and we are owning this and naming this. Why is that important to you?
I think the reason that it's important is because of my interest in history and understanding how history shapes the present, and also how history and the present shape the future. So, this has been a process that is continuing to change me. It has changed me, and it continues to change me. I'm very indebted to my daughters, who are advocates for justice. They've been heavily engaged. They've sent me books to read. And what's occurred through all of this is, we say that you want to look at something through a different lens, or to quote, walk in somebody else's shoes. I, for one, find it very hard to try, to reach that level of empathy because I haven't experienced it.
Yeah.
Right. But in doing all this, it really has created, it's not even a question of me looking through the appropriate lens. It's actually for me to, in a way, actively
repent and mean turn in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And I'm looking in that direction. So things that I didn't really think a lot about, and these are words that don't get great responses among in this part of the country. But when I start talking about white privilege, male privilege, racism, systemic racism, bias, all the different types, it's really changed for me how I look at things. And it's real easy for me to sit there and say, oh, here's Andy. He's a first-generation college grad. Well, it's a whole heck of a lot easier for me to be a first-generation college grad than someone who has come up through a different system. And then the other thing that I appreciate, and I'll try to stop after that and not be long-winded, it has really, really taught me how trauma passed through generations affects what we do today.
Yeah.
And I think that we as a society really need to understand that. I think it can speak to how we deal with each other, but also understand our own fears.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. Well, do you have any words to add about the importance of sharing this? Okay.
Well, I don't know if I really do. I just feel like I don't want to see this country go backwards.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is what is happening in so many respects in the last, 10 years, maybe more. And we made progress in so many areas with rights. And this is what bothers me, that we're somewhat going backwards, whether it's women, whether it's African Americans, whether it's immigration, whether it's whatever. I hate it. And I just feel like it's something that we need to be open about and consider that, yes, as my mother, during the George Floyd thing, and I'm going to bring in my mother, when Black Lives Matter, my mother said, well, white lives matter too. And now, please understand, she's 93. She was probably 93, maybe. She was in her 90s, and she's 95 now. And I just said, Mom, white lives have always mattered.
Yeah.
Black lives have not mattered.
Yeah.
So we have to be concerned about that. And just don't take on an argument from somebody that you heard say that white lives matter too. Why? Why are we talking black lives? Because the Black Americans have had a very difficult time. And politics has been a part of that all along. And any progress that we've made is beginning to go backwards. And I just cannot stand it.
Thank you. I actually think that was really well said. Andy, you had something to add?
Well, I also, I think the one thing, we can have a conversation about what the church did by owning a slave, what we learned, but the other part about it, then, what does that compel us to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that the one, there are several good things that have come out of this as far as our congregation. We did some activities. We went through a process. We looked back first, then we looked forward, and then we looked outward. And while some of the things that we did looking outward may not be sustainable, we have just joined the Charleston Area Justice Ministry as a congregation, which is a huge step forward.
And to say, so that's the Charleston Area Justice Ministry is, we made the 40th congregation to join it. Which is a very diverse group, interfaith, and a very diverse group that is of faith organizations that have come together to try to do justice in our area. A big chunk of that being racial bias by policing and racial bias in our schools, and some other things like that. And that, we're making, to say, yes.
And for me, it's huge growth because I've made this comment. I don't necessarily agree with all of the process of how they go about doing it, but I understand it. and I want to be a part of that because it's giving voice to the voiceless, and then understanding that as you create numbers, people pay attention to numbers because those are the people that are casting votes. Yeah. But I always have a lot of obtuse, perpendicular thoughts, and here as we are in the first week after Easter, I was driving in today and I was thinking, somebody lost their life running the Jerusalem area justice ministry.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to thank you both for coming and having this very hard conversation. And church that's been with us listening, thank you for listening and sharing in this conversation. I'm with you, Andy, that we have to say, yeah, we did this. This is a part of our history. And to continue to own it and claim it for the reasons that you're saying, right? Like, who does this make us now? And why is this important for us to say, we don't agree with this? And these are the things that we do believe. And what is that, for us to be the kind of Christians that says, this is what we believe. We believe that we are God's children and that we have done things in our past that we want to own, and we want to say we're going to do better and we're going to work towards a future, a more equitable future for our neighbors and those in our community and those around us. And that is what it means for us as followers of Christ at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And I think you're right. That's the exact statement that we say right there. That's sure. We can argue that Alexander may have had an easier go under St. Matthew's, care, for lack of a better word, than he could have working, on a plantation or laying the bricks around town or something. I don't know. I also have never dug a bunch of graves for yellow fever. What was it? I think one of the years you said it was like 150 or something, just out of this congregation in 1 year.
Just 1 year like that.
Yeah, that the pastor recorded there was 150.
And he buried others.
And so, like, I've also, that also sounds pretty tedious to me too, right? So, it's not great. And to understand that, they're like, yeah, he was still owned. And for us to, I think that there's also this air that, like, well, everyone's free now. We just kind of let that go. And it's, yeah, but that still happened. And those are still people's recent ancestors, right? I know my ancestors, going back, so, like, it's still here, it's still present, it's still with us. And I think you're right. And you talked about, generational and collective trauma, that's still here, and us ignoring it or, being colorblind doesn't make any of those things go away. Rather, all it does is we stuff things down. And I think the division gets higher because we're not actually open and acknowledging where people are at in this world.
And I from my standpoint, from a more of a scientific background, along with my historical background, it's that same old thing. If I have to deal with my issues, whether they're traumatic or not, first, before I can even attempt to try to get somebody else's. Yeah. And I think that's the hard part, that we sometimes don't work on ourselves enough to get us in a good place where we can work with and for others. Yeah. So it's, but this has been a tremendous growth experience for me, and it's ongoing, each and every day.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate those that are inviting others into this growth too. And for me, it's definitely different moving to the South. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, it's different here. But also part of it is it's also been, I would say very, I have grown a lot too of learning and understanding the different perspectives and the different, I think just like collective cultural history that still feeds into the community.
Well, I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina. I went to school here in Charleston. So I've spent almost all my life most of my life in the state of South Carolina, but I also lived 11 years in New Orleans. And that was completely different than my experience of living here. And so I think that's some of the things that, if I lived in Boston, my experience would be different. And if I lived in Baltimore, my experiences would be different. So it trying to understand that becomes really, really important.
Yeah, thank you. Well, do you have anything that you want to add? No, you're good? All right. Well, thank you guys very much for diving into this conversation. For folks listening, I would love to hear, what you think, what your feedback is. If there's anything that you would like to know more of, if you have any questions that maybe we might have answers to, we'll see if we can dig those up. We look forward to hearing from you. Just remember, as always, that you can learn more about the 10 Foot Pole Podcast at the 10footpolepodcast.com and at 10 Foot Pole Podcast on Facebook and Instagram and wherever it is that you find your podcasts. And remember, the 10 Foot Pole Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care.